Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to October's webinar. I'll just give it a couple more minutes to let more people join. Just watching the numbers of people joining. I'll just give it a couple more seconds until that number's down. Okay, let's make a start because we've only got an hour with quite a big subject today. Welcome to October's webinar with the IFE Southern Branch. Today we are joined by James Lavender and he's going to be presenting on the changes to approved document B and other relevant fire safety legislations. I just want to take this opportunity to remind everyone that any opinions in the presentation are that of the presenter and not of the IFE. Please put any questions in the chat. I will most likely be selective if there's too many questions because we want to keep this to 1 hour. If you have any technical difficulties, please try leaving and coming back in. I'm afraid I won't be able to come to any kind of hands up or reaction. So just comments or questions in the chat for me and we'll do the questions at the end. So James, if you're ready, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Donna. Good afternoon, everybody. And first off, I'd just like to say thank you to the Southern Branch of the IFE for welcoming me and allowing me to present just some information on the upcoming changes to ADB. I hope you all get out of this something interesting. I think we're in a challenging time. But no further ado, and let's kick off. Oh, sorry, wrong button. Here we go. Just to go through what we're going to be covering today. First off, bit of an introduction, looking at some of the drivers and background, then picking up on the building amendment regulations that came out this year, the influence that that's had on the approved document, and also the changes to the approved document which will be forthcoming. Then picking up on the Fire Safety England regulations, again also released this year, and then just a few closing remarks on some other considerations to be thinking about. I think it's always nice just to say a bit of a hello and about who I am. I've been in the fire safety industry for over 20 years now, coming on 25. And I'm one of the founding directors of Trigon Fire Safety. The first 10 years of my fire safety career, I was involved in undertaking a full-scale fire resistance and reaction to fire tests, as well as full-scale fire testing on buildings. And one of the images here you can see is the TF2000 project within one of the airship hangars at Cardington, which was at the time owned by BRE, looking at a 6-story timber frame building dwarfed by the extent of the testing facility. So yeah, I've had some real world experience, so to speak, with testing, which has helped me develop my fire engineering skills in the consultancy and expert witness advice which I provide. I'm also a chartered engineer through the Institution of Fire Engineers. And going forward, as mentioned, Trigon Fire Safety, was founded by myself and two fellow chartered engineers, Carl and David, just celebrating our 3rd anniversary. I don't know if you've noticed that on LinkedIn, I hope so, which has been a challenge going through COVID, etc., as a new company, but we're flourishing and focused on relationships is what the core of what we do. So hopefully through today we can start some further relationships with some of you who are present. Anyway, let's get on to some of the technical content for today. As we know, the fire engineering community has been has gone through a large change since the tragic events in June 2017. We've seen all these various guidance documents, reports, legislative changes have been issued in that interim period, and it's a significant amount of information to be shared, divulged, and digested. And as fire safety professionals, it's been, a significant amount of information to take on board. So, and this has caused the landscape to change. And for those who are maybe on the periphery of this, it can be absolutely bewildering to see all of these changes that have been brought into place. And whilst we're going to be talking about some of the further changes that have occurred and are going to be imminently occurring within the industry during the course of the next hour, I don't think that that is it, and there will be future changes occurring as well. It's worth just reminding ourselves of the transitional arrangements and the forthcoming the forthcoming impact of the Building Safety Act, which was obtained royal assent on the 28th of April this year, and looking at the future impacts of what we're going to see over the next 12 to 18 months from April. And when you consider the amount of information and change that's going to come through looking at this timeline, we have to, as an industry, be extremely prepared, well versed, and cognizant of what is going on around us and how that's going to impact on the wider industry. And I would say that looking at this timeline, it would be my opinion that these dates of 12 months, 18 months following royal assent are the absolute maximums where we're likely to see things that are changing considerably before these deadlines. So I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of this happens over the next maximum of 12 months before the Christmas of next year. So picking up on some of the changes through the Building Amendment England regulations that was brought into force this year, and it was obviously laid before Parliament on the 1st of June, with it coming into force on the 1st of December this year. It's an amendment to the Building Regulations 2000, where we've seen quite a few already, and it extends both to England and Wales, although it does not apply to any building in Wales. It's just a lovely way lawyers like to write these things. And it's worth just remembering that these are legislative changes. These are not changes just to guidance, but they are the legislative changes. So these are changes to what the requirements that underpin the changes within the approved document. One of the key changes for myself, and it's worth pointing out, is that the definition of relevant building has been changed. Previously, rooms in residential buildings or residential premises that contained a room in a hostel or hotel or boarding house were excluded from the requirements relating to relevant buildings. However, this has now been removed, with therefore effectively bringing into the definition of relevant building hostel, hotel and boarding house. So therefore extending the scope of regulation, relevant building, and the impact or the scope of regulation 7.2 and all the other supporting requirements and guidance which falls alongside that. One of the largest, or I think most impact changes that these regulations have brought in is in regard to the relevant metal composite materials, commonly affectionately known ACM and kin and alike. It's quite a significant change in the fact that any metal composite material which falls within the criteria of thickness, metal alloy, and also calorific value as set out here will no longer be able to become part of any building of any height on the external wall. So effectively a complete ban on metal composite material, ACM type material, across any building of any height as part of the external wall. And as I've said previously, this is a requirement. This is not guidance. This is a legislative requirement. Specific attachments. The definition of specific attachment has been, I would say, clarified, particularly with regard to solar shading device. In that, following the introduction of the 2018 amendment to the building regulations, solar shading device sales, etc., were challenged, and as whether there was enough consultation to actually exclude them in the ban. Well, the definition of specific attachment has been made more robust, strengthened, to ensure that it does discuss these aspects of solar shades to be incorporated within the definition of a within a definition of a specific attachment. So it's just a strengthening of the legislation around that aspect. The Regulation 7.3, the list of exemptions from the ban on combustible materials, as set out in 7.2, has been extended. Fibre optic cables, waterproofing and insulation materials up to a height just above ground level, 300 millimetres. Again, the solar shade, parts of the solar shade that do not provide the shade or deflect sunlight have all been included with the exemptions. And furthermore, we have a new classification for horizontal for flooring, where materials that are used on the floor can't be correctly tested in the vertical plane and therefore tested in the horizontal plane, as is defined by A1 FL, A2 FL, would be exempt from meeting the A2, A1 criteria for vertical aspects. This is a subtle change brought in by the amendment regulations, in that buildings, whereas the requirement for a change of use under Regulation 6 of the building regulations, the previously Regulation B41, so the fire spread over the external walls, was not applicable where the building height exceeded or was under 15 metres, whilst you'd have to comply with the other sections of Schedule B, B1 through to B5, B41 wasn't relevant under buildings under 15 metres. However, that height has now been reduced to 11 metres of the height of the building, not the story height, but the actual height of the building, to be more akin with other 11-metre thresholds, which are presented in guidance and also in legislation elsewhere. So that's just a summary of the key points of the legislation that has changed. Now I'm going to just come through, start talking about some of the key aspects of the changes to the approved document. I would just kind of like to add two caveats here. One really applies to the whole of the presentation, to say, unfortunately, this is quite a heavy presentation. It's a heavy subject, so there's a lot of content on the slides. So a slight apology for that, but also that I have not gone page by page, line by line on this presentation, explaining every change in comma, grammar, or every figure that has changed. That's really your job. I'm just trying to highlight some of the key changes to be aware of and some of the implications therein. To go through it line by line would be a whole day's exercise. So I would encourage you to pick up the relevant guidance and go through it yourself. But this is just really to give you a flavour and understanding of what those changes are and what the impact may be. So moving on to the approved document itself. Both volumes 1 and volume 2 have been, or in the course of being, updated. The amendments apply to the already amended 2019 version that had the 2020 amendments. These amendments come into effect on the 1st of December this year. However, there is a transitional arrangement that has been will be applied, which is for a 6-month period, which is that initial notice, submission of plans, etc., has been served before the 1st of December, and that building work has either started or will start within a 6-month period from the 1st of December. If there's anything that starts after that date, then the recommendations contained within the amended approved document will apply. At present, or the last time I checked on the website, there is not a concise 2022 version of the approved document as of yet. There's still just the guidance document, the kind of illustrative text explaining what is going to change. I don't know when the full approved document will be available, either for download or for purchase, but it's worth keeping an eye on it. Some of the key areas that the approved document has been updated in is the ban on combustible materials in the external walls, as we've just alluded to above, and the impact of the Building Amendment England regulations, as we've talked about. Also looking at secure information boxes, evacuation alert systems, and also picking up on some clarifications and corrections, and just general diagrams have been updated to be a little bit more attractive, or a bit more informative, if you wish, rather than the previous set of drawings or diagrams that was provided. So I'm just going to go through a few of the clauses to start off with in diagrams, and then we'll get a bit more into the meat of it. So one of the things that's worth noting is that some slight changes to various paragraphs through the approved document, and I've highlighted this one to explain, or just to illustrate that, is that the purpose group residential institution, purpose group 2A, the definition has slightly changed, as you can see, just to be more inclusive, to provide better description, and to help with the application of the guidance. So it's worth going through and checking, but there's updates to paragraphs like this that don't necessarily change the content or the context of the guidance, but they're just changing the way it's presented, so it's a lot more inclusive and a lot more a lot to be easily digested and applied. Some of the diagrams are being updated. Here's an illustration of a common 9-metre travel distance within our flats with that protected entrance hall, which we as an industry are very familiar with. What you'll see though in the new diagrams is that there's slightly better level of detail to give an illustration of certain areas, such as the kitchen area, and also information relating to the travel distance. It's not just from the furthest corner, but if you've got a dog leg arrangement as illustrated in the kitchen, it's the 9 meters to the overall travel distance, and areas where we don't need to measure the distance from, such as in the bathroom, where it might be a lower risk than you would perceive in a bedroom or a dressing area type thing. So the diagrams are updated quite a lot. I haven't brought them all into this presentation, but it's worth going through just to understand what their additional information that they are presenting and illustrating for the reader and the application of the guidance. Again, there's some guidance that's been updated, such as the lighting on common escape routes. Here's just an example where some people may perceive this as a lessening of the guidance, where if you've only got a 2-story block of flats, then you may not need to provide emergency lighting to comply with the guidance. Obviously, there's still the absolute requirement to comply with the building regulations. However, the guidance may have been perceived to be a relaxation by excluding these 2-story blocks of flats. And again, it's worth going through the updated document just to see exactly how these paragraphs have been subtly amended to reflect current thinking. Again, another one, just providing further clarification of how the guidance should be interpreted, and discussing that the where protected stairway passes from one compartment to another, it should be effectively within a protected shaft. Whereas previously some people may have been said, once you're in a second compartment, we don't need to have an enclosure to it because the compartment protects. The protection to the compartment may be sufficient. Just providing that a little bit extra clarity on the application of the guidance document itself. One of the a new section that's been brought into the approved document volume 2 is a consideration of student accommodation, previously not specifically discussed within the approved document itself, although supporting guidance and codes of practice such as 9991 does provide detailed guidance in relation to student accommodation. You'll see now that there is specific guidance being brought into volume 2, setting out some basic principles on how to address student accommodation within by following the recommendations of the approved document. Again, as we talked about previously in the first part of the presentation, looking at the regulations and the amendments to Regulation 7, the definition of relevant building has been for the exclusions to the buildings which were not the relevant building was not applicable has been removed. So as we talked about, hotel, hostel, and boarding house are now considered as relevant buildings or over 18 metres. But it's worth just remembering here, and we'll pick this up later in the presentation, that under Regulation 7 of the building regulations, relevant building is where you have one or more dwelling above 18 metres. And it's a point we'll come on to shortly, but it's just worth, I just like to remind people that is what the current definition it is in the Regulation 7 to the building regulations. One of the most significantly changed parts of the amended approved document is that information relating to fire spread over external walls has been completely replaced. So it's not been tweaked. That's not what I'm not saying that all the text and the recommendations have changed. However, there is a wholesale carte blanche replacement of the text and introduction of the new text. So this is a part where you, I would be recommending that people do spend some time to refamiliarize themselves and to double check exactly what the subtle, if there's any further subtle changes as well. However, one of the largest changes that I identified was that further restrictions that are akin to the legislative requirement for the ban on combustible materials for relevant buildings has now been reduced down to buildings more than 11 metres in height. So here you can see highlighted that all residential buildings, purpose groups 1 and 2, more than 11 metres in height, will now have the same reaction to fire classification for their external surfaces of the wall as relevant buildings above 18 metres. And it's important to remember that that requirement, well, that recommendation, I apologise, is exactly that. It is a recommendation. Whereas once you go over the 18 metre threshold, it is then a requirement. There is obviously where you're less than 11 metres, there's further recommendations on a slightly less onerous reaction to fire classification, but it's worth just really remembering that more than 11 metres, ADB recommends A2 or better. When over 18 metres, Regulation 7 requires the same reaction to fire classification, external surfaces. Furthermore, as we talked about previously, the ban on metal composite materials is reflected within the guidance of the approved document. And this recommendation is both for both ADB Volume 1 and Volume 2. Similarly, rather than just looking at the external surface, we have the same guidance from 11 metres or more on the materials used in the construction of the external wall, is that it should achieve Class A2 S1D0 or better, the same as the requirement of front buildings above 18 metres as per Regulation 7.2. So again, it's not just the external surface, it's also the materials used in the construction of the external wall. Looking at balconies, there's now recommendations within the guidance that balconies of 11 metres or more, again, achieve either one of the following conditions: either all the materials are Class A1 or A2 S1D0, obviously with some exceptions as set out within the guidance, or that the soffit itself is imperforate, has 30 minutes fire resistance rating, and is of materials A2, S1, D0 or better, and that the surrounding materials have a classification of B, S1, D0. Now, it's worth noting, or just remembering, that if you were to adopt one of these criteria for your balconies, that where your height of the building then exceeds 18 meters, if that's the case, then it would then be a relevant building, and option B would not be available to you because it would then be, say, a relevant building, and the materials must all achieve class A1, A2, S1, D0. So option B is really available to those up to 18 meters of height from this 11-meter threshold. So it's a band of 7 meters. As we previously discussed, introduction of the metal composite materials and the prohibition thereof. The requirements of Regulation 7.2 Requirement B4, looking at student accommodation, boarding schools, hotels, hostels, etc. And also, again, being updated to reflect the solar shading and materials therein. I think it's quite interesting that there is a specific clause within the approved document that says that the curtain of solar shading devices cannot be classed as a membrane. So people who may have considered the curtain of a solar shade to be a membrane and therefore exempt by virtue of Regulation 7.3 of the building regulations, there is a recommendation within the approved document strictly recommending against this interpretation of the legislation and guidance. Some further amendments to the volume 1 of the approved document. Evacuation alert systems being recommended for buildings with a story height over 18 meters, and also that secure information boxes being provided with flats the top story over 11 meters. So as you can see, some additional provisions there. That really covers the main salient changes of the approved document. As I said previously, I haven't listed every single clause, comma, salient, every point that needs to be considered. That's really for yourself to digest in the comfort of your own homes and really enjoy and see what is being presented. But I think it's definitely worth picking it up and going through it if you haven't done also already. So now looking on to the Fire Safety England regulations, and I brought these into today's presentation really just to be because they do have a bearing on the approved document, and so I think it's important to just understand them a little bit wider and bring them back onto the table. So these regulations were laid before Parliament on the 18th of May this year, and they come into force on the 23rd of January next year. So a couple of months longer than the update to the ADB and the previous regulations. However, they don't impact directly the building regulations. It's changes in reflect of the fire safety order. So looking, as we all know, about existing premises, irrelevant if we're going through building work, change of use, material alteration, etc. Again, they extend to England and Wales, but only apply in England, and don't apply to domestic premises in the House of Commons, Lords, or some military premises. There's no transitional period from what I've seen, and it's mainly from the 23rd of January next year that they are in force. Previously, I mentioned about the definitions, And within the Fire Safety England regulations, they consider high-rise residential buildings, and a lot of the regulations therein apply thereto. However, the definition of a high-rise residential building is 2 or more sets of domestic premises, not 1 or more, as per the building regulations. And then also 2 sets of domestic premise rather than dwellings. Now, the regulations themselves don't state what a set of domestic premises are. To me, I think it's sensible. It's a dwelling, which is not a commercial entity, as we know where the defines of the fire safety order. But it's interesting to note how different legislation covering the same aspects such as fire safety can contain anomalies between definitions, which can become confusing or start to become ambiguous when interpreted by people using these requirements or the supporting guidance that we expect to be forthcoming. So going through some of the most salient points in this legislation, as we saw within the approved document, there is a requirement for high-rise residential buildings to install premises information boxes. Together with the information box, we have to be providing means to act for the fire and rescue service, local fire and rescue authority, to get access to these boxes. And these boxes must be inspected as well as their contents on an annual basis. So there's no ambiguity. The wording in the legislation is very decisive. These must be installed. So it leaves very little room for movement in that context. Going on, looking at materials in the external wall, as we've discussed already. In relation to the high-rise residential buildings, the responsible person must identify the risks that are presented with materials used in the external wall, and any mitigation steps that have been taken because they may or may not present a higher than acceptable risk to the building and to the building occupants. And it's important to note that this information, again, must be provided to the local fire and rescue service in an electronic format. So there is a communication point here that has to go along with the responsible person and the local fire and rescue service. Furthermore, the regulations require that, again, the responsible person must prepare floor plans of the buildings, identifying features such as lifts for use as firefighters, evacuation lifts, and key firefighting equipment. As well, there must be a hard copy placed in the secure information box, and this information should be shared electronically with the fire and rescue service. There's also a requirement for a single page building plan identifying some of the relevant information in addition to the plans. And I'll just give you a very brief overview of the level of information that's required. So the environs in the building, the access arrangements for the fire appliances, the use of the building, dimensions, number of stories, basement levels, the presence of maisonettes or scissor section flats, etc. So it's dry riser, wet riser inlets, shut-off valves for sprinklers, access points to the building, location to secure information box, location of controls and any of the smoke control systems, firefighting shafts, stairways in the main building, and evacuation alert system. That's a lot of information to contain on a plan on a single page. So there is going to be a lot of information available, which, in accordance with the requirement, must be prepared and contained within the premises information boxes. Going on, lifts and firefighting equipment. These must be under inspection, and routine checks must be undertaken of the lifts, evacuation lifts, firefighting equipment in the building, relating to fire detection, fire alarm systems, evacuation systems, door release mechanisms, all within the common areas on a monthly basis. And if a fault's identified and it can't be rectified within 24 hours, the fault and the subsequent rectification of the fault must also be reported to the local fire authority. What does routine check mean? The definition of a routine check is that the equipment is in efficient working order, good repair, and carried out in accordance with the industry standard. So however they either manufacturers recommend that you inspect it, or a British standard, that would be a routine check. Wayfinding signage. Previous recommendations and requirements shown in the ADB introduced wayfinding signage for high-risk residential buildings. However, now the Fire Safety England regulations has brought in to ensure that the high-rise residential buildings of existing buildings also have suitable markings in there to identify the floors and the flats accessed off of each floor, and again in accordance with the guidance that was previously provided in the approved document. So that now applies effectively to all residential buildings over 18 metres in height. Information for residents. So information being provided to residents, but not only to high-rise residential buildings, but to any residential premise which has got 2 or more sets of domestic premise and a common area through which the residents escape. So relevant of height. Would now need to be containing the relevant fire safety information, what to do in case of fire, either height, identifying it, sounding the alarm, leaving the building, etc. Additionally, though, not only has it got to be displayed within the building, all new residents as they move in need to be informed and provided a copy, and it needs to be provided to all residents at least every 12 months. So it question, how do some landlords know who's in or who's out of the building when premises are let or exchanged? That needs to be managed and controlled by the responsible person. Fire doors, again, information must be provided to the residents on the use and the importance of fire doors, which doors are fire doors, and information about them. And where we have buildings of 11 metres or more in height with 2 or more sets of domestic premises, best endeavours, which is I think is a good term, to check the flat front doors every 12 months. So access will be required into some of the flats, irrelevant of tenancy arrangements that are existing, but also flats in the common areas need to be checked every 3 months. So as you can see, there's quite an impact on existing residential buildings, both those above 18 metres in height, the higher risk buildings as defined by the regulation, but also those under 18 metres. There is still a significant impact on existing fire safety arrangements for the relevant persons. So moving on, you'll be glad to know that I'm nearing the end. And just to pick up on some other aspects of fire safety that it's just worth bearing in mind. I've talked a lot today about, two pieces of legislation and a piece of guidance which is being updated. But we mustn't forget that there are other items of fire safety advice, requirements, topics that are ongoing and will be changing, such as the London Plan, competency, vulnerable and disabled persons, the new 991, this ADB, question, will there be another ADB in due course? Planning Gateway 1, Future Gateway 2, cavity trays. A significant amount of information will be forthcoming and also available. And one of the ones that is picked up is some of the recent letters that have been issued by BRAC and amongst the government relating to provision of single stairs in tall and very tall residential buildings, and the applicability of the approved document. If you haven't seen these, it's worth getting onto the government's website under building regulations and just quickly having a read of what BRAC and the department are saying in regard to the applicability of the approved document and how that should be digested. So in summary, the fire safety landscape in terms of legislation and guidance has changed a lot in the past 5 years. It's going to continue to change. And I would expect further guidance and legislation to be issued in the forthcoming years. The changes that are recorded in the current amendments to the approved document are both legislative and of guidance. And so when applying the guidance and legislation within the approved document and using it on a specific project, we issue caution. I think it's worth just really familiarising again what is the requirement and what is recommendation. It's worth noting as well that the British standards don't currently reflect the proposed changes to guidance and legislation. The 9999, 991 don't currently reflect this. So it's worth bearing that in mind. And again, finally, differences in terminology between legislation, guidance documents, they can be very subtly different, maybe with the same intention, but also would have just a health warning, just to ensure that you're using the right terminology in your approach to certain challenges. So, and thank you. I hope that was all enjoyable, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, James. That certainly was quite heavy, as you warned us. Lots of information to take in, both on new developments coming up and existing buildings. Do have a couple of questions. I will start from just a few slides in where we were talking about very tall buildings. What is defined as a very tall building?
Oh, that's an interesting question. There is no true definition of very tall building. The approved document certainly doesn't define it. Depending on how the letters are read from BRAC and the department, you could say that a tall building is anything over 18 metres. But then that may question the applicability of the approved document being suitable for tall buildings, and whereas the approved document itself does provide guidance for buildings up to 50 metres, depending how you interpret it. And so it's a difficult one, and I don't think that there's an exact answer. I think it's one that the designer should be wary of, and one that may be early consultation with the enforcing authorities to agree an approach. But it's certainly a controversial question, and that's probably not the most helpful answer. But unfortunately, there isn't an answer that's set out in guidance or legislation as we can see it at the moment.
That's perfect. As you said, we're expecting more changes and things are moving all the time in the industry. So hopefully at some point that definition will come up. Someone has suggested maybe it's above access tower height. But yeah, we'll keep an eye on new legislations and guidance to see if that answer pops up. Someone has asked, in terms of now measuring the height of a building, what about in a scenario where there is a pitched roof? What part of that roof would be considered in the measurement?
Part of a pitched roof. From my recollection, it's the mid-height, the average of the highest and lowest part of the pitch. Please forgive me if it's slightly wrong, but my recollection is it's the height of the building would be measured from the lowest, typically from the lowest side of the building on, if it's a sloping side, to the mid-height of the pitch of the roof, between the lowest and the highest points, and that would be the height of the building. There are different ways of measuring the building depending on story height, fire brigade access height, etc. But for the height would be the lowest side ground level to the mid-height of the pitch.
Brilliant, thank you. Also, a lot of people are very interested to know if you're happy to share the slides or the video after the presentation.
Certainly happy to share the slides, and I don't think it would be a difficulty sharing the video either. But yeah, we'd certainly be happy to share a PDF of the slides.
Excellent. So the branch will share that out with everybody. Just checking if I've got any more questions. Someone's asked about the variations in terminology. I know you mentioned a couple of them. Do you have any more examples to look out for?
The ones that the biggest one for me is the definition of high risk, high rise residential building, and it's considering what the legislation we've talked about today is discussed. So what does the building regulations describe? What does the Fire Safety Order, the Fire Safety Act, the Fire Safety England regulations we just spoke about describe? And then also looking at what Gateway 1 in terms of the town and country planning regulations, which were amended to pick up Gateway 1, describe as in high risk, high rise residential buildings, and the Building Safety Act. So it's how these four strands really to our legislative framework fit together. I don't know why, I just had an analogy of a musical instrument with all these strings being pulled at the same time. And if they're not aligned, it could be horrible. But if they are aligned, it could be quite sweet. Sorry, that's my brain. And I think it's ensuring that you are aware of what piece of legislation you're looking at and then the definition. But yeah, the Building Safety Act, the Town and Country Planning, the building regulations, and the Fire Safety Order and supporting legislation on that.
Excellent, thank you. So James's details are on the screen. If you do have any more specific questions or you wanted a conversation with him over the changes, please feel free to get in contact and we will finish up. I hope everybody has a lovely evening. Thank you again, James.
No problem. Thank you very, very much.